As much as endgame is the focus, the leveling process has the potential to deliver a really enjoyable campaign that properly puts the world into World of Warcraft. So with that in mind, is Legion's questing any good? Well, I've played 3 out of the 4 leveling zones on the alpha, the final one isn't available yet, so while things may change, this will give a good overall picture of the zone's quality. So I'm going to go over both the good stuff and then where there is some room for improvement. Let's start off with the good. So the zone level scaling means you can do any zone in any order. I really like how this gives the game a little bit more of an open-ended feel. This is also going to apply at endgame, but we haven't really been able to test that yet. Now, there are downsides, and I will cover them in this video later, but for now, the freeform nature of things is a really nice plus. Visually, all 4 of the leveling zones have a quite different look and feel. I think all of them are quite wonderful, and they are some of the best work the Blizzard has put together in terms of zone art. There are only 4 leveling zones in Legion, so making sure that each one is visually different and quite rich was an extremely important goal, and as far as I'm concerned, they've pretty much managed to do that. Within each zone, the narratives are actually quite good. Now, it's very much Blizzardy, so you're not going to have a deep and meaningful, personal experience that challenges what you think, but it's going to be a pretty decent popcorn time. High Mountain is a little bit more interesting in terms of its narrative. It's got some cool callbacks to past events in the world. Val'sharah also does have some pretty cool moments. Unfortunately, we do not have access to Azuni yet, but if it is of the quality of the other 3 zones, I will definitely be satisfied with it. In tandem with the narrative content, we of course have voice acting. So voice acting is back. It's very much in the Warlords of Draenor style. It isn't all implemented in the alpha. In fact, most of it is not implemented. However, it is going to be following in the same pattern. From what I've heard, it is Blizzard quality voice acting. You know what that's going to entail. It will be poorly directed. It will be poorly written.
Malfurion, thank Elune you've come.
It is good to see you again.
You must come quickly. Something's happened.
But it will have the key advantage of allowing people to get the narrative without having to dig through loads of quest text. Another quite nice feature is that NPCs will sometimes bark at you whenever you aggro them. This is quite a nice touch for a few different reasons. First of all, it does make the NPCs of the world feel a little bit more alive. And second, it's just a nice little indicator that you've aggroed something if it says, hey, I'm going to kill you, and you turn around, you've got a very cool, charging at you. I know I am quite critical when it comes to the quality of the voice acting, but trust me, I do think that overall having it in the game is a plus and it is a good thing. Now, moving on to game mechanics, the quest flow is actually quite nice. At a few points, they will send you off to hubs, which breaks up the linearity. I would still like it to be a good bit more non-linear, with just hubs which exist as their own little parts of the world. That is present in some of the zones. I overall would like things to be closer to, say, Wrath, but credit where it's due, the zones are definitely quite good from a flow perspective. They also make great use of bonus objectives, which are going to be returning in the form of what they call world quests. So often you will get a narrative quest from an NPC that will tell you to go and maybe talk to somebody, kill a named mob or something like that. Now that quest that you get from an NPC will take place inside one of these world quest enabled areas. So if you just want to play through the story content, you can go ahead and do that. But if you want to stay behind a little bit afterwards and clear out the area, then the world quest will facilitate that. This actually helps cutting down on the sort of random arbitrary quests that you get from NPCs, and I suppose it also does keep their motivations and their dialogue a bit more focused on the narrative instead of telling you to go and dig up 10 soil patches or something monotonous like that. They have also continued to include exploration content, so this means mini-events, rare mobs, treasures, things like that. Very similar to Warlords of Draenor, but what does interest me is how these are going to function at max level, because this will all scale up, so at max level, what's a rare mob going to be like? Interesting sort of thing to think about, but regardless, for the leveling experience, just like with Warlords of Draenor, I think this is a very good point here. I do hope that they balance the XP and stuff like that, so that it doesn't end up being the case like in WoD, where you can level up at a pretty absurd rate by doing some funny business with the treasures. Each zone's progression is bookended by a dungeon now. I think this is a really great move that allows for each story to be concluded in a more exciting and group-focused manner, which is perfect considering this is an MMO after all. It also reflects Blizzard's commitment to make dungeon content matter a bit more in Legion. Of course, past expansions did do similar, but rather than the dungeons feeling like the bit after the main story, they feel like the conclusion of the main story, and it does work quite well, and it definitely ties strongly into the narrative, the main narrative and plotline of each zone. Also, the game is going to feature a few cinematics. They're not in the game yet, but assuming parity with the Warlords of Draenor ones, I think they will be a great benefit to Legion. Alright, so let's move on to a few criticisms. The first one is that each zone's narrative is quite fragmented. So in Legion, players can tackle any zone in any order. What this has in effect done to the narrative is it's meant that there cannot be an overarching story from zone to zone like they did in Warlords of Draenor. You can have a situation, say, where Yril and Murad, well, only for a while, are following the player character from zone to zone, and you get some character progression there. That actually isn't possible with the way that Legion is set up. Well, it is possible, they just haven't done it that way. So the positive aspect of all of this is that each zone does have a very strong identity because their narrative is very much self-contained, but the negative is that the Burning Legion threat doesn't particularly feel too real. You're going off and fighting 4 isolated campaigns which don't really tie into each other. Now, this is based off the alpha so far, and after completing every artifact quest and 3 of the 4 leveling zones, the hope is that any additional cinematics and the content of Suramar are able to ratchet up the stakes here, but it does feel more fragmented than, say, what we had in Warlords. Another large concern of mine is the length of the content. There are 4 leveling zones in Legion in comparison to Warlords of Draenor's 5 per faction, Mists of Pandaria's 6, Cataclysm's 5, Wrath's 8, and TBC's 7. Additionally, each zone is very, very short. The questing takes me from 1.5 to 2 hours to complete, so overall we are looking at about 8 hours of content before you're going to be hitting endgame. There is less leveling content than Warlords of Draenor has, well, on paper. Each artifact weapon quest does take from 25 to 50 minutes, and we don't know how long the Broken Shore event is going to be. This certainly is a cause for concern, though the zones themselves are very nice. I just wish there was more of them and that they were perhaps a little bit longer. And this does take me nicely onto the topic of replayability. As much as being able to do any zone in any order is nice, there are only 4 darn zones. I do not think replayability is going to be good in this expansion. There just doesn't seem to be enough leveling content for one character, let alone several. Looking back at, say, Cataclysm and Wrath of the Lich King, having multiple leveling zone paths was a great practice. Wrath had enough content to give you multiple playthroughs with a mostly unique experience, and at least in Cataclysm you were able to choose between Hyjal and Vashir. This kind of thing would really benefit any given expansion months after launch when players start to think about leveling up a new character. So overall, what are my thoughts about Legion's leveling? Well, Blizzard do show some really good ideas, like as an example, the zone scaling and being able to tackle anything in any order, but as is often the case with Blizzard, they just fail to make enough of it. For whatever the sort of given system to actually matter. This idea of doing any zone in any order would be great if you had loads of zones and you could really have freedom, but really, when you can do any 4 zones in any order, and there are only 4 zones, there's no choice there in terms of, different characters getting a different experience or anything like that. The narrative doesn't really tie together as well as a lot of Warlords of Draenor's does. I prefer some of the zones to Warlords of Draenor's zones. Certainly, I think that none of them are maybe as good as like Shadowmoon Valley or Frostfire, though I think I'm a little bit in the minority when it comes to really liking Frostfire. But I do think they're better than, say, Talador, Nagrand, probably Spires of Iraq, and definitely Gorgrond, which I didn't particularly like. So they do have some really nice zones. They've got some nice bits of narrative stuff. There just needs to be more content. It still feels like this is a Blizzard which is trying to make a Call of Duty campaign more than they're trying to make a open world RPG. So the focus is firmly on endgame. For what Blizzard wants to do, I think this leveling process will accomplish their goals. It will get people from the start of the expansion right into endgame super fast. And then, of course, the hope is that the endgame content has really got a lot of longevity to it. Certainly, the dungeon system looks really good in Legion. I'm sure the raids will be fantastic, as they pretty much tend to be in World of Warcraft, and we'll just need to see what the rest of the world content is like at endgame. So there's a lot of promise, there's some good, some bad, hopefully they learn from it. They've definitely shown some really good ideas. That's pretty much it for me with this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.